today I'm going to be speaking about creating safety when people are in crisis. So unless I get a nudge otherwise, I'm going to assume you can hear me and you can see me. So yeah, that's the topic for today. So the first thing I wanted to say is that this is a tough topic. So we're going to be talking about identifying and supporting people in crisis and exploring the risks and the issues that can show up in those situations for our communities and for our team. So yeah, it is a tough topic. And if you need to take a break or you need to return to the recording at a future time, you can do that. Please do what you need to, basically. So why am I speaking on this topic? It's because I've been there. I've been in situations where I've seen people in crisis, and I've helped to manage those situations and I've helped to support people. So specifically, yeah, just edging into 16 years of experience in building and leading online communities. Some of that was in the brand community social media space, but mostly in building communities of circumstance and peer support communities for health charities. The sort of spaces where you're bringing together patients and carers and family members, that sort of thing. Yeah, so as a result of that type of work, I have direct experience in identifying and supporting people who are vulnerable, people at risk of harm and abuse, and people in crisis situations. And in order to do that work, I've completed specialist training. So that's things like empathic communication, supporting vulnerable people, safeguarding. I also have training in counselling skills and mental health first aid. And to add to that, I have the direct experience in not only doing some of that work, but in leading an active community and in supporting and training my team to operate the community safety. And that's some of the work I'm now doing in Good Community, which I started a couple of years ago, but I'm doing now. I'm spending more of my time now over the last year or so. And basically, it's a freelance consultancy. And the idea is to help people to build ethical and effective communities in a way that protects and improves well-being. So yeah, trying to kind of straddle both of those things. So I think it's really important to recognise that you should expect to see people in crisis, and that's whether that's in your community or whether that's in your own life. And I imagine many of you probably have already done so, and we know why. So we do live in an uncertain world, and there are many issues. And you can see some of those issues. That was actually a news story I was reading just around the psychological impact of some of the kind of polycrisis issues that we've heard during this conference, and we've obviously read as well. So there's many different things, and coronavirus is just lurking at the bottom there. But as many of you know, we are still in a pandemic. It's just in the tail end of it. But yeah, so there's a lot going on. There's lots of uncertainty. There's many issues that, for many reasons can have an impact on the people in our communities. So yeah, in the talk, in the conference itself, if you haven't gone and have a look at the other sessions, I've been dipping in and out, and I've been really impressed with the quality of what I've seen here. So do have a look at the trauma-informed session. Do have a look at some of the sessions around difficult issues and conflict and wider kind of geopolitical and socio-political issues, because this is very much touching on the type of thing I'm going to be talking about today. So we know it. There's trauma, there's toxicity, there's all sorts of difficult issues out there. So you will see people in crisis in your community at some point, and they may reach out for support either to you or to the wider community. So it's important to know not only how to support people, but how to maintain safety for all. So I like to put a summary together so you know what you're in for, so to speak. So this is a summary of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to be looking at how to identify and support people who are in crisis. We're looking at putting safety first in our work, the value of effective boundaries, the importance of robust support, and community policy as protection. So I wanted to start, before we head into the main context, or content of the talk, I think it's important to set some context. So I'm going to ask you a question. What do we mean when we talk about people in crisis? Yeah, so just to clarify, this talk's focus is to talk about individuals who are in crisis today. So we're not talking about organizational crisis situations, and we're not talking about specific crisis issue handling. So global or national issues that an organization might have a specific remit. So think about disasters emergency committee, for example. So yeah, we're talking about individuals who are in crisis. Okay, so when we're supporting people in crisis, it can help to think about the situations that people could face. And there's lots of information out there around people in crisis and supporting people in crisis. There's quite a lot already available, many of them written in psychology resources. And there's lots of different types of personal crises. So we heard some examples just now from the audience. And there's lots of articles that talk about a type of crisis that a person may face. So I've taken a slightly different angle, actually, and looked at it slightly differently. So if you want to go ahead and look at those resources that are out there on types of crisis and people that are in crisis, there's lots of resources already available. But for moderation, I find it more helpful to consider the different causes of a person being in crisis. And I think that's especially helpful when we're thinking about the severity and the immediacy of a crisis situation. So if you're looking at the cause of a person in crisis from a triaging perspective, in a decision-making perspective, that helps to understand the severity and the immediacy for that individual. So we've got direct types of crisis on the slides. This type of personal crisis is the most serious, usually, and it happens when somebody is experiencing a direct and a personal risk of harm. And we've got a few examples there of self-harm, suicide, emergency, harm or abuse, and a mental health crisis. And then we've got circumstantial. Now, some personal crisis situations can be caused by a circumstance. That's an external event that is directly or immediately impacting that person's life, leading to crisis. And that can be things like bereavement, a job loss or debt, relationship change, health diagnosis, or chronic stress. And then we've got external. Now, sometimes personal crises can be caused by a combination of external factors and something else. So you might look at that list and think, I'm not sure how those things would lead to a personal crisis for someone. Well, we might look at those causes and wonder that, but if you think about how an external event could trigger a crisis, it can happen if a person has previous trauma or is experiencing mental ill health. So you think about things like a news event or a war, for example, and that might be a war happening in a different part of the world, but where that person has a connection to, or it might be that that's happening and it's bringing back memories for that person, or it's impacting them in some way, or bringing back a triggering event. And one example I've seen in my moderation experience was news about a historic child sex abuse case was a triggering event, and it did actually lead to crisis for one individual. National crisis, so things like the COVID-19 pandemic, which whilst we all lived through it, for some individuals, it became a crisis situation and it was very difficult for them to cope. And then things like bad news or harm for someone close to them. So you can see how those types of crisis, some of which we heard earlier, depending on the cause, you can see that the severity or the immediacy can be different. And that's not to say that there can't be a severe crisis from the circumstantial or external events, but it's just to say that looking at the likelihood of risk, sometimes in terms of that direct, it's usually a more immediate situation for people. So let's think about identifying people in crisis now. It can be obvious sometimes, but when we're moderating, often, as we know, it's contextual. And sometimes it can be a combination of assessing what they say, what they do, and other factors. And now when we're thinking about what they say, it might be that they speak directly about the crisis situation, they disclose details, they ask for help, or they might make threats or demands which may or may not be relating to the situation. And there might be things that they say that are directly or indirectly indicating a potential crisis situation. And that can be things like expressing hopelessness, talking about suicide or death, or talking or feeling unable to cope. There are other things. So sometimes it's not just what someone says, it's what they do. And that behaviour could indicate that the person could be in crisis. So if we're seeing conflict or anger, extreme reactions, or absence from community discussions or events that they would normally attend, yeah, that can sometimes be an indication. Also, just to say that there can be other behaviour change, most notably behaviour that seems out of character for that person. And on many communities, we do get to know people and we can get a sense of their lives and what may be going on for them. And then there are other factors to consider, especially if we're assessing potential situations and actions to take. And that's things like the tone and the frequency of the content, the severity or the immediacy of the situation, the level of risk to the person, and then other things like the risk to others and the impact on community. And sometimes that's as much about the moderation action we might more broadly take. Sometimes it's about the particular safety actions that we might need to take as well. So there's two different lenses to look at here. So once we're aware of the causes of a crisis and how it can show up for people, it's also important to understand what a person in crisis may need. And so what I've done is had a look at those needs and considered what we might be seeing in an online community. It's worth bearing in mind as well what might be happening for a person who's in crisis. And if you've done any mental health first aid training or any emotional support training, you'll be aware of some of this. But people in crisis are likely to be in a heightened emotional state. They could be feeling distressed, despair, fear, or a sense of being alone. So their primary need, their most common need, as far as I'm concerned, is usually emotional support. So that emotional support can take different forms. It could be things like showing compassion, showing empathy, non-judgmental listening. And it can include things like acknowledgement for them, validation of their feelings. And sometimes the validation of the feelings is important if someone's experiencing a mental health crisis and you're considering how to show that what they're feeling is important rather than situations they're describing and you're not sure whether or not they may be true. So that's something to bear in mind with validation. But it's very important primarily to show the validation of feeling. And then reassurance is part of that emotional support as well. The other thing to bear in mind when we think about people in crisis is, in addition to that heightened emotional state, which often happens, people in crisis can also feel overwhelmed, confused, and not sure what to do. So they may also lack the confidence or the ability to find information or to make decisions. So it's worth bearing in mind that the kind of mental overload, I suppose, can come into play as well. And so if they're likely to need immediate information and guidance, and in many cases they are likely to need information and guidance, that could include things like immediate help or direct support, and things like information and resources. Now, when we're talking about information and resources, we're talking specifically about those that bring clarity and calm and help them to make informed decisions. And there are other needs. Now, they are likely to be out of scope for most online communities, in my experience, but they include things like practical assistance, advocacy and representation, and ongoing direct support. So that might be things that actually, you could signpost them to, or you make them aware of in supportive conversations. But yeah, there are other needs that potentially someone in crisis might need. So once we've got a better understanding of people in crisis, we've considered the causes, the potential, signs of it, and the particular support needs for those individuals. It's then important for us as moderators or community leads to decide what appropriate action is needed. And this can be a careful balancing act, and it's based on a few different things. So it's based on the severity of the situation, the immediacy of the risk, what can be done, and that's what potentially can be done, in that situation by somebody who's remote, by somebody who's online, by somebody who's in this particular role. There's a lot that can happen in that kind of what can be done part of this assessment. And then the other thing is your organisational remit. That's also really important here. So if you don't already have one, it can help for you or the team or to request it from a community lead. It can help you to design a risk matrix or a threshold tool. Now, this can help you to identify actions for the different scenarios that you or your team may face. And just to clarify, I'm not just talking about scenarios that are relating to people in crisis. It can actually be a more broader, more holistic tool. So it can cover other risk situations for the community. And sometimes having that risk matrix can be really helpful. It might be that it's a chart like this, or it might be that it's in your guidelines, your process, etc. But something that has that sort of level of risk there and the types of actions that you might take. Now, the examples I've put here are publicly available, and they relate to adult and child safeguarding. And the reason why I've put those up is because if you're putting together some sort of a risk matrix, particularly if you're supporting people who could be in crisis, you're thinking about those safeguarding or emotional support situations, it can be helpful to start by looking at the resources that are used by organisations that routinely handle those complex issues. And then you can scale down as appropriate or amend as appropriate. But you can see the different scenarios here. You've got a safeguarding sort of flow chart that's there. And then you've got a different chart that's a little bit more kind of public facing or a little bit more kind of user friendly. And then you've got sort of like a kind of threshold sort of triaging tool in terms of levels of support. And I think that's really important when we're thinking about scenarios, because we all know there's no one size fits all sort of scenario here. So actually having that practical tool that you can use can be really useful. So now let's move on to thinking about taking appropriate action. So if been considering, somebody in risk, the causes and the types of behaviour and the levels of, how we might look at the situation. We're now moving into action. We've started with that triaging work, thinking more broadly about the types, how to assess the type of action you might take. Now we're looking at the appropriate action. And the most important thing to say around appropriate action is it's going to depend on the level of risk and your organisation's remit. So when I'm teaching this, and I teach it a few different ways, but normally in how I teach this, I look at the 3 S's of community safety action. And you can see those 3 S's here. So the sort of action you might take if someone's in crisis could include one or all of the following types of responses. So you've got supportive responses, and that's coming alongside somebody either on the community itself or in private messaging to offer support using some of those empathic techniques that we were talking about earlier. The other thing to mention is signposting, and that's signposting to resources and to external organisations. And that can include external organisations that can offer specific support, external organisations that offer emotional support or listening services, crisis services. And the third thing to mention is safeguarding. And what I mean by safeguarding here is a specific activity that's taking place to help support somebody who could be at risk of harm or abuse. And those safeguarding actions can lead into more kind of one-to-one casework or one-to-one escalation of safeguarding. And like I said, it really will depend on the risk to the person and the remit of your organisation. It might be if someone's in a very immediate crisis situation, your organisational remit may stretch as far as signposting. You may not be moving into that one-to-one safeguarding space. Or it may be that you're in the type of organisation that I was in for a while, where we had a specific safeguarding duty of care, specific safeguarding policies, and quite detailed training to follow. So it really will depend on your situation, but one of those 3 S's is likely to be there for appropriate action. And it's worth mentioning moderation as well. So we're probably aware that when a person in crisis shows up on an online community, they may say things or do things that may be a little bit outside of our rules and guidelines or outside of the culture of the community. Or it might be that the conversations that are happening start to veer into that moderation. There are broader discussions, there are broad pieces of content shared. And yeah, the moderation action may be needed. So it's worth bearing that in mind. And what I'd say here is considering, with moderation, you're looking at those breaches of rules around conduct and content. But it's worth thinking about when we moderate someone in crisis. It can feel very delicate, actually, and it's quite difficult work. And sometimes it can be difficult to know whether we can moderate or whether we should. And I think in many cases, you've got to make a bit of contextual decision there. But I'd say if the moderation action is needed, you're going to be doing that with a careful hand and with empathy and with care. And I think the key here, if you're thinking about kind of how and why to do it, is to do what is necessary given the context to contain the situation. So I usually recommend taking a stance of education rather than enforcement, unless that's necessary. And I can remember one time having to step in and moderate a very difficult situation. Basically, what had happened was there was a really thoughtful and quite sensitive discussion happening on the community around handling signs of suicide ideation in family members. And one very helpful and quite long-standing member had shared details of suicide actions that were taken by a close family member. So unfortunately, due to the fact that that content was shared on the community, we had to take the call to step in and explain that situation. Now, given the context, we communicated with the member and they then self-edited to remove those details. But sometimes, depending on the situation, it might be necessary to step in and edit the content that's happening that's not appropriate. But usually that's if the person is offline or if the situation kind of warrants that immediate action. But yeah, more broadly, when we're moderating around people in crisis or moderating people in crisis, we're considering that empathic, more education sort of stance, and then doing what is necessary to contain the situation. So we're moving kind of into the halfway, just over the halfway point into the rest of things that we're now thinking about. What's happening here in terms of the dangerous territory. So when we're supporting people in crisis, we can unwittingly enter dangerous territory. And that's often by doing too little or going too far. So I've got some examples here just to talk you through in terms of like, where can that dangerous territory happen? The first thing to say is inaction. Now, inaction can stem from not knowing what to do or worrying about doing the wrong thing. And so sometimes we don't do anything. And that can often be a mistake. The other thing to mention is the toxic positivity. And I think, many of us know what toxic positivity is. It's like bringing positivity to the party and drowning out everything else. And in fact, making people feel that anything but positivity isn't appropriate. And that's really difficult. And sometimes that can show up when we're supporting people in crisis. And other responses that either dismiss or ignore the person's feelings. And then we've got taking action that doesn't acknowledge the person or address the issue. And then the other side of it is where we might go too far. And that can happen when we've got a team or individuals that go into rescuer mode. Now, anybody who's unfamiliar with that term, Kaufman's drama triangle sort of comes into it. So pretty much we're talking about a dysfunctional or unhelpful feeling, basically. It's the rescuer's personal duty to save that person and to assume responsibility for them. And often that kind of helping or rescuing goes beyond what's appropriate or goes beyond the role. So that's what that rescuer mode applies to here. The other thing to bear in mind is breaking privacy or personal boundaries when offering support. And then taking actions that are beyond your policy and setting an unhelpful precedent for the future. So we're probably aware, but it's worth clarifying and just talking about it for a bit, the sorts of stress and risk factors. So this work can be stressful and risky for your moderators, your community leads, and for the organisation. So there are a few different things to go through that are examples of this. There are others, but this is broadly what we're talking about here. So your moderators could find it difficult to handle emotive or abusive content from people in crisis. They could be dealing with dependent or demanding conversations, communication. They could be moderating harmful content that's posted by people in crisis or about that topic. And the risk could include things like vicarious trauma. Last year's talk that I gave gives a little bit more information about that. Stress and anxiety due to the impact of supporting people in crisis, and feeling unable to switch off, and that can lead to burnout. And organisations may face issues relating to things like gaps in policy or training, inconsistent process, inadequate safety actions, and the risk could include things like complaints, team stress or illness, and staff turnover. So we're aware of what a person in crisis could look like, and we've learned about the stressors and the risks that can impact on the team and the organisation. I think it's quite obvious, but again, it's really worth pointing out. So I always do talk about this idea of safety. We're talking about safety not just for the person in crisis, which is something we want to be able to create for them, or at least point the way towards safety for them, depending on what our role and remit is. But we're thinking about safety for everybody. So yeah, we're looking at the member, we're looking at the community more broadly, we're looking at the community team, and then we're looking at the organisation itself. So that creating safety piece actually does cover everybody. So we can understand that importance of safety. I'm fairly sure we're all on the same page here. And we can understand how that safety needs to underpin our communities. But how do we do it? And I'd say there are three things. I like alliteration in case you haven't noticed in my talks, but there are 3 R's that we can consider here in terms of creating safety. And we've got role, remit, and resources. So with the role, there is clarity on what the team should do and how they should do it. And that's especially important. You've got a crisis situation, you've got a process to follow, and that creates safety, it creates certainty for people. And then you've got the remit, and that covers the actions that are appropriate for that role, and when that remit ends and they then escalate or they step back. And that's a really important thing to consider, especially if the situation seems much bigger than what your community usually covers, or much bigger than what a particular role is about. And that rescue risk we were talking about before, knowing that the team have done enough, knowing that they've met that remit, knowing that you're clear about the remit is really important. And that remit has different levels. So when you've got multi-role teams, and I had teams that had different roles in it, you've got those sort of collaboration and escalation points. And that's really important. And the third R is resources, and that's resources in terms of information to support the community itself, and then the separate area of resources for team support. So having those 3 things in place, or improving and increasing those 3 things, you're more likely to be able to create safety in those crisis situations for everybody involved. So let's move on. Got a few more slides to get through. I'm conscious of time, so I don't want to dawdle. So earlier we focused on identifying and supporting the person in crisis. And I'd mentioned that I was going to share 3 principles, the 3 principles that keep coming up whenever I look about supporting people in crisis, and I'm thinking about what the kind of principles that underpin this work. There are 3 principles that will help the community team and help the organisation to do this work safely. And the first principle is to put in place effective boundaries. So as we learned earlier, some of those dangers and risks of supporting people in crisis can come from doing too much. And that's often things, we're talking about going beyond that remit, that rescuer stuff. It's also about getting drawn into the anxiety or feeling unable to switch off. And I keep talking about the rescuer. I'll talk about a couple of other things as well. So when we think about boundaries, they're especially helpful for anybody on your team who identifies as a helper, an empath, or has that kind of rescuer tendency. So when someone feels motivated to help others, they have that helper role. And I think most of us have gone into community work, those of us who are community professionals, whether we're mods, whether community leads, etc. We want to be able to help other people. We want to be able to make a difference. That helper role, that helper motivation is really important for us. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just there can be risks associated with that kind of helper role, those motivations, those tendencies. The other thing to mention is people who feel other people's emotions very deeply. That means they're likely to be empaths. And if you're a very empathic person, There's something about grounding, actually. We are not talking about grounding today. I think maybe we should another time. Or in fact, I'd love to talk about boundaries in more depth, but maybe another time. But yeah, there's something about that work of being an empath. You're absorbing other people's emotions. And those two things, that helper and empath, actually make you more likely to be a rescuer. That tendency we were talking earlier about being personally responsible for other people. And you can see that person there holding the umbrella for one person getting completely soaking wet themselves. And the graphic we can see here, that idea of actually the boundaries are sort of infringed on and you're sacrificing more and more of your needs, but that becomes a precedent and the expectations increase. And you can sort of see how that, if that happens as a pattern of work or it keeps happening, then that can have a real impact in terms of that person's well-being. And if you're going above and beyond in your personal life or in your professional life, that can be counterproductive. You can neglect your own needs. And I'm going to be really blunt here and say nobody on your community team should feel they need to be a superhero or an emergency service worker. And that's even if their work involves routinely supporting people in crisis. We all have a role and a remit to follow, and we do what we need to do, and then we move on. And actually, it's boundaries that I think that is most helpful in helping us to do that. So how can boundaries help? So here's a few examples, including infographic here with examples about the benefits of boundaries, and this is quite a broad example of benefits. This is for personal and professional reasons, but they're really important when we're supporting people in crisis because we're connecting with others, we're using empathy, we're researching information, we're communicating support, and we're keeping a watching brief on the community. And all of that work, in addition to the rest of the work of community building, when we think about events and other areas of work, meeting people, etc., that's energy intensive work. And when you think about the work of dealing with other people's stuff, and I was talking about managing emotional labour a while back as well, it's really energy intensive. And actually, it does mean that boundaries become all the more important. Everybody, moderators, community officers, community leads, everybody has the right to set appropriate boundaries and to enforce them. Those boundaries help us to separate work from life. They stop that rescuer mode from creeping in. They create space between us and the people we support. And they preserve our energy and they protect our health. And that's really important to say about boundaries. I think they really are life-giving sometimes. So you might be thinking, yeah, we're talking really broadly about boundaries here, Serena, but let's talk about how they actually apply to community teams. Let's think a bit more practically. So let's look at 5 examples of relevant boundaries that are for community teams. So I will start with mentioning remit. I keep talking about this, but I think it's one of the most important things in terms of our community work. Your remit is a boundary. It means being clear about what you do in your role, what your responsibility is, and what you escalate to a leader or to an external organisation. And that's really important. Your work shift has a time boundary, and it should be clear on how to hand over any live issues and to step away from your work. And that's stepping away overnight, over the weekend, or handing over to another shift member, or being able to step away and go on holiday. And something that I used to communicate to my team really clearly every week, have a handover. Week team to the weekend team, weekend team to the week team, me to my line manager, me to a colleague. That process of handover, that process of telling people what you're doing, and sharing work with people and pairing people together on projects and things. All that collaboration, all that handover is really important because what you're doing is you're continuing to maintain that culture of it's not entirely your job to do this stuff all the time. And that's really important. Process is a boundary too. Clear steps to follow to support the person appropriately. And again, I love a process. I've written many processes, but yeah, people think they're dry, but they're really not. Because when you're in a really difficult situation, you don't know what to do. Having a process there, even if it's just a couple of steps to do, broadly in this situation, this is what we do. That process provides you with that clarity. And then guidelines. Guidelines are often a conduct boundary, but they can cover other things. But it does need to be clear when to take moderation action and what to do effectively. And the most important one there is those personal boundaries. And this is really important for moderators, really important for your team, and for the community lead. And that should be there in your organizational policy, quite frankly. It should be there in your community policy and your guidelines, your training, etc. You should be making it really clear, your community education. You have the right to be treated with respect. No one has the right to overstep your boundaries. No one has the right to, wage rampage on you. Your organization should never put you in a position where you're at risk. And no one should be overstepping those boundaries, treating you disrespectfully or putting you at risk. It's really important stuff. So we've explored our first principle in supporting people safely, and we know how boundaries can help. And more broadly, boundaries create space. But our second principle is creating that foundation of robust support. Robust support really does provide the foundation, and this foundation enables the community to operate smoothly. It's this foundation of support that ensures the needs of the community, the team, and the organisation are met. So let's talk about support. What do I mean? That's a really broad word, and I think it does a lot of heavy lifting. And I think it's a word where we're like, support could mean anything. Let's talk about support in this context. 3 important areas. How does support show up when we operate in the community? How does support show in kind of team support, peer support, and how does support show up in how the community lead supports the team effectively? So operating the community, a couple of things to think about there. An up-to-date list of helpful resources that you can use to support others. That is a support resource for the team as much as it is for the individuals you're going to be helping. Templates. And those templates provide a framework for those support conversations. And then you've got that process and procedure that empowers the team to take action. And something that can really help underpin that or provide that or clarify that is specialist training in moderating complex issues and supporting people who are in crisis. Peer support is important too. So we've got things like that peer support space. When I'm talking about a team-only space, I'm talking about a synchronous or asynchronous space. It could be private. It should be private, should I say. It can be synchronous or asynchronous, but definitely clearly identified as a confidential and safe space for the team, and it should be private. It provides a space for validation, self-expression, or just to offload. And when you're dealing with difficult issues, whether it's conflict, conduct issues, you've got people in crisis, you've got stuff showing up on the community, really important to have a space to talk to the team either directly or over time. Connecting that team socially if you can, and providing time for development. And what underpins all this is something really vital, and that's known as psychological safety. Giving the team freedom and permission to ask questions, express concern, or ask for help. And that's really important. And then thinking about managers offering support or team leads, there's 3 things there. Giving the team permission to check in, really important to have that. And then when you think about when they're checking in, how do managers help? And I think setting some sort of reflective practice, and it doesn't have to be formal, it can just be more informal, but setting that reflective practice in place so that you're able to offer support and guide people through a situation, help them to reflect on it, help them to be reassured that they did the right thing or potentially learn. And that's always really helpful. And that kind of psychological safety is part of that too. And then thinking about resources. So we've got that list of internal and external resources for support. So it could be things like emotional listening services. It could be things like an employee wellbeing program. It could be things like information that's available. And then other things, so for the manager, getting advice on policy, managing crisis and team management can really help reinforce that support. So we're moving on from boundaries and robust support. Let's look at that third principle in supporting people's safety, and that's community policy. So you may be surprised when I say that community policy is a form of protection, but it is. Now, when I say community policy, what I'm talking about is the specific policy you might have, guidelines, process, and procedure all together. And effectively what they do is they empower and they protect your team and your organisation. Policy is really great for a few reasons. It establishes clarity on what you do, how you do it, and why it matters. It helps you identify and mitigate your key risks. And that might be things that come up quite often, or things that are particularly risky for your organisation or your community. And the other thing is that it can reduce the likelihood of team mistakes or issues that kind of come up that are problematic, things that can lead to team stress or complaints, effectively. So how do we ensure community policy is protecting the team and the organisation and enabling us to support people in crisis? Here are some key areas to review. So ensure your organisation responsibility and remit is established, especially around your duty of care and the expectations on the levels of support to provide to people in crisis. So those 3 S's I was talking about earlier. Do you go so far as signposting? Is that your responsibility and remit? Do you have a specific safeguarding remit organisationally? And very few, some organisations will, health organisations in particular will, but others, you're going as far as signposting and you're just being clear on how to do that. The defined approach on how you support people in crisis, that process situation that I was talking about earlier. So yeah, that defined approach. And again, I keep talking about remit, but it's really important. Each person on your team being really clear on their remit and receiving the appropriate training and resources to do it. That's really important. Providing those escalation and reporting processes and templates. Now, templates aren't just for moderating by numbers. People get quite tired of templates sometimes, but they're really important. It's not just about the copy and paste job, as many of you know. The reason why they matter is because they provide a structure for the team to follow. It reduces the stress of reinventing the wheel. It helps newer or more uncertain members of the team. And it also helps create that consistency in your approach, avoiding some of those risks and issues that we talked about earlier. And the last thing to mention that I keep talking about, but it's really important, is providing that updated list of helpful organisations that can be used to signpost people or for team support. Let's summarise what I've spoken about today. So we know the causes, the signs and the needs of a person in crisis. We understand that taking action involves balancing the situation, what's possible and your organisation's remits. We're aware of the dangers and the risks that are involved in supporting someone in crisis. And we know that the role, remit and resources can create the safety and enable this important work. And then we looked at those 3 principles: the value of effective boundaries, that robust support is the foundation for supporting people safely, and that community policy and guidelines can protect the team and the organisation when supporting people in crisis. So we've gone through a lot in this session and there is a lot to digest. So what now? Here are some important next steps that you can take. Check your processes, review your support, and create or improve your policy. So yeah, during this talk, we heard a little bit about the value of specialist training and advice to support people who are in crisis and to keep your team safe. And if you feel you need support in this area, I may be able to help. So I could help review your policy and practice, train you and your team, and provide advice on handling issues. So yeah, thank you for taking your time to listen to me. Thank you for taking time for this really important topic today.
So some excellent folks have asked some questions here. And I just wanted to bring them to your attention. So
sure.
You kind of you've tackled a few of them. Some of them were asked a little early, and then you went on to sort of address them somewhat in your conversations about boundaries. Jenny Burke asks, how do you suggest staff manage crisis when they may not be well supported by their organisation, which, as we know, certainly does happen, or perhaps even you have someone who is freelance, solo, volunteer, just working on their own, quite isolated. How do they, if they don't have the structural or institutional support or can advocate to improve it, what are some of the things they can draw on in relation to what you've been discussing?
Yeah, that's a really helpful point. And thanks, Jenny, for bringing that up. Yeah, I've been in a situation, I've been really fortunate to be able to create that safety for my team and to help provide that training and those resources. I think there's a level of considering the difference between personal responsibility in the job and personal responsibility for your well-being and then where that line is for you. So personal responsibility in the job. So if you're not being provided with those resources and you want to do a good job, looking at the more general holistic processes that are already out there that you can apply to your work. If you're not going to get that safety advice from your organization, what's possible that you could put in place? What sort of process could you put in place for yourself? What sort of learning could you do that just helps you know, here are the places to signpost people, here's what I can say to people, here's how I can reassure myself in this work. So more broadly, and then just thinking about you can manage up and try and help influence those resources as well and help try and bring that. But I think it's really clear that you're not doing that to try and, your responsibility is just to look after yourself in the role. So just making sure you do as much as you can in terms of the resources and the process you need to do it well. And the personal responsibility, so just really increasing the responsibility for your own well-being. So what I mean by that is just being even more intentional about self-care, even more intentional about well-being, because the balance of your energy, you need to redress that. But I'm not saying that it's your responsibility to look after your well-being and nobody else's. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is do take care of yourself even more in those situations. And the other thing to add to that is there's a line to draw. So if at some point you're being put in a situation where the job is making you unwell, if the job is having a real impact on your health, if there's appropriate avenues you can follow within the organisation to help with that, it might be that actually well-being sort of like a little fluff word that they bring out once a week, you know, once a year, and they don't really care. In which case, it's a working out for you what's safe, and if that's the job starts to feel unsafe, then looking at effectively leaving it, which is probably, you know, a bit renegade advice, but yeah, if a job's making you ill, nothing's worth that. You know, well, your health is really important. So yeah.
This is a sort of, you touched on this a little with your point about, but I just want to give you an opportunity to elaborate if you wish.
Yeah.
Harriet asked sort of about, working with volunteer models in communities where, they are also a part. They are also very much an active co-constituent. They're a member, and some more active than others. And how do you balance that? That boundary setting and support them and enable them to do that effectively when they're quite emotionally invested or have that personal connection.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, Harriet was, just for clarity, Harriet was on my team at Alzheimer's Society, and she's amazing. And she knows that boundaries were something that we were dealing with volunteers. You've got that sense of duty and you've got that sense of personal responsibility. So we started to do work with educating the volunteers around boundaries, and keeping people safe, because we had volunteers who were going beyond the remit of their role in terms of hours, in terms of worrying about the situations. And what we were doing, we were signposting them to counselling. We had clinical counselling available. We had specialist training. We were doing sessions on how how stress might show up for you and how to look after yourself. You can do all of those things for people, and it's really important to try and do as many of those things as possible. Make sure your process is there. Make sure your remit is there. Be really clear with people on what that is. Now, if they don't follow your advice, and we had a couple of people who sort of kept going beyond the boundaries or kept sort of breaching that or asking questions or expecting, all you do is you reinforce what is safe for your organisation and you provide what's available for that person. And sometimes it's just them feeling heard, that we thank you for the amount of time you're putting in. We thank you for the support you're giving, but we do need to remind you that, please look after yourself and please be safe in this work. And we're asking you to do this amount of time and we're asking you to support these things. Please look after yourself. When you go beyond those things, you could be putting yourself at risk. So sometimes it starts to move into a supportive, but ultimately a conversation about them going beyond the remit. And we've been in situations where sometimes you have to say to people, look, I'm going to need to talk to you and ask you to please not go beyond your hours, or please not go beyond doing these things, because it's really important for you. And sometimes it can start to move more into a conversation about their boundaries. But yeah, that's really important. And I think that sense of responsibility we all have. And I've been in situations in the past where I was effectively on call 365 days a year. And even junior doctors don't have that. And it's really, come
not
on.
getting paid that well.
Yeah, tell me about it. but you put in place what you need to, and you do everything as far as your remit allows, as far as what's good practice allows. So Jenny was talking about, you go beyond that. You go into good practice if your remit in your organisation is a bit skewy. But it's just working out, I've done enough here and it's okay. Like, that thing about you don't have to be a superhero and you don't have to be, I have to keep telling myself that in this work, because, my own tendency, I want to fix the world. I want to make things better for everybody, but you can't do that. You can do what's appropriate. You can do what's compassionate, but part of that compassion piece is compassion for yourself, and compassion for your life. And if you start to get to a point where work starts to overtake life or work starts to overshadow life, I think those are the two things where you really just look after yourself.